All right, guys, we're back, and we are continuing our discussion of torture. Once again, I'm going to say that there's, disturbing image, disturbing content warning. This is a very tough thing to talk about. It's difficult for me to even record this video, but I think this is a very, very important subject. I think it's very important that people know more about it. So even though it's difficult for me, I'm going to do it. In this subsection, we're going to talk about kind of the process of torture. And it is a process, okay? It's not one act. It is an entire process, and that usually begins with arrest. People who are going to be tortured are usually arrested in much different ways than people who are not, right? If any Americans who watch Cops or other shows, you're aware of kind of the normal arrest process, at least in the United States, right? We put people in handcuffs, we read them their rights, we put them in the back of a police car, we take them to the station where there's lots of people around and they get booked and fingerprinted and, all these things. For people that the government knows it wants to torture, that is usually a vastly different process. They're usually arrested at night in their homes or otherwise kind of surprised and whisked away. Many times they're blindfolded or hooded so they don't understand where they're going. They have very little said to them about what they're being arrested for, where they're going, or what they've done. They're taken to out of the way places where they're alone. They're not allowed to see family or a lawyer or anything like that. So there is a process of isolation and dehumanization and humiliation, and that takes time. That is a process. It's not just the physical pain. It's also these processes of breaking you down. But when we talk about the ways that physical pain is actually done, the ancient world had a bunch of different techniques. Some of the more famous were the rack, which is pictured here, where basically you're tied to different moving things and then stretched to the point where, in many cases, your limbs are literally torn from your body. The thumb screw, this one in the picture, he's got his index fingers in there, but it's more commonly they use it with the thumbs, and then it's just a screw. And the more you tighten the screw, the more it crushes whatever appendage you have in that space. Drugs, that's kind of a more modern way to torture somebody. There are drugs that kind of the opposite of morphine, right? Instead of curing pain, they cause pain. They just burn and hurt and make your mind do weird things. And especially during the Cold War, many countries did a lot of research on how to create these drugs that would be torturous without kind of leaving a trace, right? Because the rack and the thumb screws and things like that, those leave a physical, easily identifiable mark to show that the person had been tortured. Whereas with drugs, if you do it right, there is no physical sign that the person has been tortured. Another one that goes back to the ancient times but is still used a lot today is beatings on the soles of the feet. Right, so they'll take a rod or a something and beat the soles of the feet, because that's a very, very sensitive part of the body. That's a very it can cause a lot of pain with relatively little permanent damage. Whereas if you're beating somebody in the head, the amount of pain you get before you're, giving concussions and scrambling their brains or even killing them is a lot lower than the amount of pain you can give to somebody on the soles of their feet before there's like life-altering damage. And then, of course, electricity, the famous way to torture people. It's been used in lots of movies and stuff. there's actually this field telephone, which was used in the Vietnam era. Essentially, there was a little mini electrical generator, and if you spun a little thing, it would create electricity coming from these two things, and it was just enough to run the telephone. But there were a lot of accusations against the U.S. military and our allies, who we gave those same field phones to, that they were using it to torture people. They were using that electricity generation power of the telephone to stick those electrodes in, let's just say, very sensitive areas. I don't want to be crass. I mean, we're talking about torture, and here I am afraid of being crass, but I realize how ridiculous that sounds. But they would put those electrodes in the genitals and other very, very sensitive areas, and shock people and torture them into giving up information. In the 21st century, torture is still around. Torture is still a relatively distressingly common thing. But we kind of, as a world, we pride ourselves on doing it in a more clinical way, which I think is a little very disturbing. But some of the things we've added in the 21st century, or late 20th century even, there are instances where people are kept in tiny rooms, like 5 feet by 5 feet, so they can't even lay down correctly. They have random, the lights go on and off at random times. The sounds, they have really loud, like a buzzer sound or music or whatever that goes on and off at different times. And those are especially useful for sleep denial. If you can deny people sleep for long enough, their will to resist completely breaks down. Their sense of self kind of leaves them. So they're more compliant, if you will. And then, of course, random temperatures make it freezing cold, and then, 20 minutes later it's boiling hot. Just that randomness is especially important for breaking down someone's psyche, making them kind of lose their sense of self, making them kind of forget who they are, which again is kind of really the point of torture. That's one of the goals of torture. Rape. Rape is a very, very common tool of torture. It's obviously especially common to rape female prisoners, but it's also not really uncommon to rape males either, as a form of torture. It combines, the physical pain, the dehumanization, the attack of the self, the humiliation, all those things, all those kind of goals of torture are accomplished very efficiently through the act of rape. And it's a really, really, really horrible thing, but it's disturbingly and distressingly common all throughout history, right up until today. In Pakistan, not only do they have rape used as a means of torture, but they add on an extra kind of humiliation, an extra, one more layer of destruction of the identity. And after prisoners are raped, they can be tried and convicted for adultery. The fact that you are raped does not prevent the government and the legal system, excuse me, does not prevent them from saying you had sex with somebody who wasn't your husband. That's illegal. We're going to now punish you for that. And that, I think, is incredibly scary. That is evil in a way that I I don't know if you'd given me 100 years, I don't know if I could have come up with that idea. I mean, that's disturbing and distressing in lots of ways. Here in the United States, the Justice Department actually sued the states of Michigan and Arizona because essentially they were not preventing prison guards from raping inmates, mostly female, but also male. Essentially, those state prison systems were just turning a blind eye and allowing prison guards and prison staff to rape inmates essentially at will. In the Balkans, in the 90s, there was that big kind of civil war and lots of warfare and death and all those horrible things. But in addition to that, there were 20,000 civilians that are estimated to have been raped by invading forces, invading soldiers. And that is really, really disturbing and distressing. In the United States, we had the War on Terror, right? September 11th, 2001, we were attacked by Al-Qaeda. Horrible, horrible day in the lives of every American who was alive at the time. Everybody who lived through that can tell you exactly what they were doing on that day, which really it really affected the nation. I'm old enough to remember life before 9/11 and after 9/11. It was a very, very different country after 9/11. But we put in place policies for torture as part of our War on Terror, which was a complete overreaction, really played into the terrorists' hands because we became the monsters they had been accusing us of being by using these torture activities. One of the things we did was called rendition, where essentially we would capture a terrorist or a suspected terrorist, and we would say, look, we're not allowed to torture you, but this other country is. So we're going to give you to them as a prisoner. They'll torture you, and then any information they get from that torture, they'll give back to us, right? That was a illegal but very common thing that the United States did in this War on Terror, is we would give a lot of these prisoners to other countries just knowing they would be tortured, and we would get any intelligence out of what that situation brought about. Another thing we did was waterboarding. Now, waterboarding, pictured here, is where essentially you simulate drowning for the victim. Their body believes they're drowning. It acts like they're drowning. Now, when done correctly, people don't actually drown. It just makes the body feel like it's drowning, so the Bush government at the time tried to say that waterboarding wasn't torture. They called it an enhanced interrogation technique. But that argument would have gone a lot better if we hadn't tried, convicted, and in some cases executed Japanese leaders after World War II, specifically for waterboarding our soldiers, which we referred to as torture back then. So waterboarding was torture in the late 40s. I believe it's torture in the 21st century as well. And then, of course, there was the photos that came out of the U.S. military prisons, where prisoners were humiliated, degraded, made to do things that were specifically designed to cause a loss of self, a loss of identity, a loss of personhood. Um, so these were the very things that psychological torture, in addition to physical torture, um, is describing. This is a very shameful part of American history, but I believe we have to learn about it if we're going to learn from it and make sure we don't kind of repeat it in the future. But I'm going to end this subsection here, and we're going to come back for another subsection.